7 days from today, at 1 minute past midnight, the United States government is going to make every car built in Canada 50% more expensive to bring across the border. Not 25%, not a threat. 50% stacked on top of tariffs that already exist. And almost nobody outside the auto industry has noticed it is coming. This is not speculation. On July 20th, President Trump signed 3 separate proclamations under a law called Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930, a law that had not been used this way in nearly a century. One of those 3 proclamations targets Canadian-built motor vehicles directly. The other 2 hit Canadian dairy and Canadian alcohol. Together, they cover roughly $20 billion of goods crossing the border every year. The deadline for all 3 is the same, August 19th, 2026, 7 days from now. Section 338 itself deserves a moment of attention because it is not a tool presidents reach for casually. It was written in 1930, buried inside the same Tariff Act that deepened the Great Depression, and it gives the president authority to impose tariffs up to 50% on any country found to discriminate against American commerce. For nearly a century, it sat almost entirely unused, a legal option so rarely invoked that most trade lawyers had never seen it applied at this scale. The administration's own fact sheet cites Canada's discriminatory treatment of American products as the trigger for using it now. Whether or not you agree with that characterization, the fact remains that Washington just reached for a tool it has not used this way in generations and pointed it directly at Canadian cars, dairy, and alcohol. If you want to understand what is actually about to hit American wallets and who inside Washington's own trade agreement is quietly getting hurt by this, stay with me for the next few minutes. Subscribe to Power Map because we track exactly this kind of story before it becomes a headline everyone else is scrambling to explain. Here is the part that should stop you cold. The United States and Canada have a trade agreement. It is called USMCA. It exists specifically so that vehicles built across this integrated supply chain do not get taxed like foreign imports. Under that agreement, a Canadian-built vehicle that meets the rules of origin is supposed to be protected. That was the entire point of the deal Trump himself signed in his first term. This new 50% tariff ignores that protection completely. The proclamation is explicit. USMCA origin does not shield covered vehicles from this new duty. Read that again. A trade deal that was supposed to guarantee tariff-free treatment for compliant vehicles is being overridden by the same administration that negotiated it. If you are an American car buyer who assumed USMCA meant stability, that assumption just expired. This is not the first time Washington and Ottawa have found themselves here. Trump's first term saw tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum, a renegotiated NAFTA that became USMCA, and years of softwood lumber disputes that never fully resolved. Each of those fights eventually settled into some form of managed truce, but none of them touched the auto sector at this scale. And none of them explicitly stripped USMCA protection from a covered category the way this proclamation does. If this becomes the new template, the calm truces of the first term stop being the model, and unilateral tariff swings become the default setting for how this relationship runs. Now let us talk about why this actually reaches your driveway, and not just an auto executive's spreadsheet. The Canada and United States auto industry is not 2 separate industries trading finished cars back and forth. It is one integrated production line that happens to cross an international border. A single auto part can cross that border up to 8 times before the vehicle it belongs to is even finished being assembled. An engine block might be cast in Ontario, machined in Michigan, shipped back to Ontario for final assembly into a transmission, then sent back into the United States one more time before it ever reaches a dealership. The Michigan and Ontario manufacturing cluster alone produces 22% of every vehicle built in North America. 22%. That is not a niche supply relationship. That is a fifth of the continent's entire auto output running through one cross-border corridor that is about to get taxed at 50% on covered vehicles. So what does that mean in real dollars for you, the American buyer standing on a dealership lot in a few months? Industry researchers at J.D. Power have already modeled what tariff and counter-tariff exposure does to vehicle pricing, and their estimate lands at roughly $6,000 added to the average cost of a new vehicle. Separate analysis on pickup trucks specifically, the best-selling vehicle category in America, puts the added cost as high as $8,000 per truck. And that is before you account for the simple math of parts content. On a $40,000 vehicle, even a small 2 to 3% increase in the cost of imported components adds $800 to $1,200 directly onto the sticker price. Multiply a 50% tariff across the parts and vehicles that are actually covered, and those numbers stop being an estimate and start being your next car payment. American automakers are not sitting quietly while this happens. They have already paid more than $10 billion in tariffs this year alone on vehicles and parts crossing in from Canada and Mexico. $10 billion already spent before this new 50% layer even takes effect. That cost does not disappear into a corporate balance sheet forever. It gets passed forward onto lots, onto financing terms, onto the exact vehicle you were planning to buy this fall. And there is a labor story hiding inside this that almost nobody is telling. More than 125,000 people are directly employed in auto parts manufacturing and vehicle assembly in Canada. These are not abstract foreign jobs disconnected from the United States. Many of those workers are producing components that get shipped straight into American assembly plants, becoming part of vehicles built on American soil, driven by American families, sold by American dealerships. When you tax that supply chain at 50%, you are not just taxing Canada. You are taxing the American factories on the other end of that same production line. Put a face on that supply chain, and the stakes get sharper. General Motors builds full-size pickup trucks in Oshawa, Ontario, vehicles that show up on American dealer lots as Chevrolet Silverados. Stellantis builds the Chrysler Pacifica minivan and the Dodge Charger at its Brampton and Windsor assembly plants, sold coast to coast in the United States. Toyota's Cambridge and Woodstock plants in Ontario build the RAV4 and Lexus models that regularly rank among the best-selling vehicles in America. Honda's Alliston plant builds the CR-V and Civic, two of the highest volume nameplates in the entire American market. These are not obscure imports. These are some of the most recognizable, best-selling vehicles in the country, built on Canadian soil, now facing a 50% tariff on entry that their own manufacturers have to absorb, pass on, or fight. So why is this actually happening? The official reasoning traces back to April of 2025, when Canada imposed its own retaliatory tariffs after the first wave of Trump tariffs landed. Canada put a 25% tariff on American-built vehicles that did not qualify for USMCA preferential treatment, plus a separate 25% tariff on the non-Canadian content of vehicles that did qualify, administered through automaker-specific quotas. It was a direct, calculated countermeasure. It worked in the sense that it hurt. From April 2025 through March 2026, Canadian imports of American-built vehicles dropped by approximately 22%. That is $5.6 billion in American vehicle exports to Canada that simply stopped happening. American auto workers building vehicles meant for the Canadian market watched a fifth of that demand disappear in 12 months. Wall Street noticed immediately. Shares of GM, Ford, and Stellantis all moved on the news the week the proclamations were signed, with analysts flagging the auto sector as the most directly exposed part of the entire Canada tariff package. Credit analysts have started asking a pointed question in their research notes. If a 50% tariff can override a signed trade agreement once, on the basis of a discrimination finding that Washington itself gets to define, what stops the next administration, or this one, from applying the same logic to the next category of goods. That question is exactly why auto industry lobbyists have been pushing harder for a deal before August 19th than the dairy or alcohol sectors combined, because the dollar exposure sitting inside vehicles dwarfs the other two categories put together. Now, Washington is answering that drop with this new 50% tariff on Canadian vehicles, dairy, and alcohol. The White House insists this is not a trade war with Canada and has left the door open to a deal before August 19th. But here's the trap in that framing. Every day that passes without a deal is a day closer to a deadline that does not move on its own. 7 days from today, this either gets resolved or it becomes law at 1 minute past midnight, whether anyone in Washington or Ottawa is ready or not. Inside Canada, this deadline has already split the country's own leadership. Ontario Premier Doug Ford has been blunt about what he wants to see happen. Respond tariff for tariff, dollar for dollar. No hesitation, no diplomatic softening. Prime Minister Mark Carney has taken the opposite posture publicly, saying Canada believes in the benefits of free and fair trade and pushing to close a negotiated deal before the deadline hits, rather than escalate into a fresh round of retaliation. Two of the most powerful political figures in Canada disagreeing in public 7 days before a 50% tariff lands on their own auto industry. That is not a footnote. That is the entire Canadian response strategy, still unresolved with a week left on the clock. And it is not just politicians who are alarmed. The Ontario Chamber of Commerce, representing thousands of businesses across the province, called this tariff escalation, needless, and reckless. Their own words. A business organization, not a political party, describing its own trading partner's decision as reckless, 7 days before it takes effect. For Canadian auto workers, the stakes cut just as deep from the other direction. A 50% tariff that makes their vehicles uncompetitive in the American market does not just hurt an abstract national trade balance. It threatens the same 125,000 jobs tied directly to parts and assembly work, jobs in Oshawa, Brampton, Windsor, Cambridge, Woodstock, and Alliston, towns where a single assembly plant can be the largest employer in the region. If American demand for these vehicles drops the way Canadian demand for American vehicles already dropped by 22% after Canada's own retaliatory tariffs, the shift is not theoretical. Plants adjust production schedules to demand. Production schedules translate directly into shift counts over time, and in the worst case, layoffs. Nobody wins a 50% tariff exchange. Both sides absorb real damage on real payrolls in real towns, while the negotiation plays out in Washington and Ottawa. Let's put the full picture together, because this is where it gets uncomfortable for anyone who assumed this was just a Canada problem. Dairy gets 50% more expensive to import from Canada. Alcohol gets 50% more expensive to import from Canada. And motor vehicles, the single largest consumer purchase most American families make aside from a home, get 50% more expensive on the covered portion, with USMCA protections explicitly stripped away for this specific tariff. The proclamation does carve out one exception worth knowing. Vehicles already covered under existing Section 232 auto tariffs are excluded from this new 50% layer, so it is not a blanket doubling across every single Canadian vehicle on the road. But the White House's own Trade Representative's office confirms these three proclamations together cover approximately $20 billion of imports, about 5% of everything the United States imports from Canada in a given year, concentrated into just three categories that hit American consumers directly at checkout. 5% of total imports sounds small until you realize it is concentrated entirely in the categories people actually notice. Nobody feels a tariff on industrial machinery parts sitting in a warehouse. Everybody feels a tariff on the truck they are financing for 6 years, the wine they buy for a birthday, or the block of cheese in their grocery cart. Some of this is already showing up on the ground. Dealers who carry Canadian-built models have reported buyers rushing to close deals before the 19th, hoping to lock in a price before any tariff pass-through hits the invoice. That kind of short-term rush usually does two things at once. It pulls sales forward that would have happened later in the year, and it creates a false sense of calm right before the actual price increases show up on the next shipment of inventory. If you are shopping for a Silverado, a RAV4, a CRV, or a Pacifica in the next 2 weeks, you are shopping inside a pricing window that closes at midnight on the 19th, whether or not anyone at the dealership tells you that directly. So here is where this stands with 7 days left. Canadian and American negotiators are racing to reach a deal before the clock runs out. If they succeed, some or all of this 50% tariff could be delayed, reduced, or restructured before it ever touches a single invoice. If they fail at 1 minute past midnight on August 19th, the tariff becomes automatic, immediate, and binding on vehicles that were supposed to be protected by the very trade agreement Washington itself wrote. Either outcome is a story. A last-minute deal proves that 7 days of pressure can move an administration that insisted it would not budge. A failure to reach a deal proves that even a signed trade agreement is not a guarantee against sudden 50% tariffs when political leverage is on the table. There is a bigger question sitting underneath all of this that outlasts whatever happens on August 19th. USMCA was supposed to be the settled rulebook for North American trade, the agreement that gave manufacturers, workers, and buyers on both sides of the border a predictable set of terms to plan around. A Section 338 discrimination finding just proved that rulebook can be set aside unilaterally on terms Washington defines for itself, with 7 days' notice before the deadline binds. Whether or not this specific tariff survives the negotiation, that precedent does not go away. The next dispute, whatever it turns out to be about, now has a proven playbook sitting on the shelf. Let's put every number from this story in one place, because together they tell you exactly how serious this is. 50%, the tariff rate landing on Canadian vehicles, dairy, and alcohol. $20 billion, the annual trade value covered by all three proclamations combined. 22%, the drop in Canadian demand for American vehicles after Canada's own retaliatory tariffs. $6,000, the average added cost per vehicle according to J.D. Power's modeling. $8,000, the potential added cost on a pickup truck specifically. $10 billion, what American automakers have already paid this year in tariffs on Canada and Mexico before this new layer even applies. 125,000, the number of Canadian jobs directly tied to the parts and assembly work now sitting inside the blast radius. And 7, the number of days left before all of it becomes binding at 1 minute past midnight. What we do know right now, today, is this. American car buyers are entering the most important week of pricing uncertainty this industry has seen in years, and most of them have no idea the clock is even running. Michigan auto workers are watching a $5.6 billion drop in Canadian demand for their vehicles collide with a fresh round of tariffs on the parts that come back the other direction. And two of Canada's most powerful leaders cannot agree on how to respond with 1 week left to decide. This is not a distant policy debate happening in a courtroom or a committee hearing. This is a countdown with a fixed date, a fixed time, and a direct line to the price on the windshield sticker of the next vehicle you buy. If you want to see how this actually resolves, whether Washington and Ottawa land a deal before midnight on the 19th, or whether this 50% tariff becomes the new baseline for cross-border vehicles, that is exactly the kind of story we track here. Subscribe to PowerMap so you see the outcome the moment it breaks, not weeks later when the price increases have already reached the lot. Drop a comment and tell me this. Do you think Washington and Ottawa reach a deal before the deadline? Or does this 50% tariff go into effect exactly as written? 7 days left to find out.